Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. At the time I'm recording this, Donald Trump has just received his fourth indictment by a grand jury. He now faces 91 charges across 4 jurisdictions: Florida, New York, Georgia, and the District of Columbia. He has 2 trial dates set, and it's looking like more charges are going to be added on. So he could easily get up to 100. He's almost there now. In spite of this, and in spite of the fact that some of this action on the legal front is being brought by people he himself appointed and other Republicans that he didn't appoint. In spite of all that, all the lying, all the deceptive practices, all the bullying, remember what he did to Gold Star families. In spite of all of that, there are still about 1/3 of Americans who think that Trump is not only innocent, but some sort of a messiah figure, that he is boundlessly wonderful, that they will follow him no matter what, that no amount of wrongdoing can be proven to diminish him in their eyes. The story that they tell themselves and each other is that he's the only one at his level who gets them. He's the only one who really knows and sees them. And they get a sense of significance because they're part of a group. So obvious questions would be, why are they doing this and what can be done about it? This is flagrant authoritarianism. It's worship of authority, obedience to authority. There's been all kinds of psychological and sociological research done on this. But it's still happening. And it's not just the United States. It's happening in other countries too. So what is that and what could be done about it? These are huge questions. And I would like to focus through the lens of something I've been calling loreology, L-O-R-E-ology. When people see it in writing, sometimes they call it loreology. I don't know why, but it's loreology because it focuses on lore. It focuses on what we use as our received truths, wisdoms, practices in navigating our way through the world. Another way of expressing it is that loreology studies what these navigating stories, I call them keystone stories, are all about, and how do we get locked into them, and how can we free ourselves from them when they're too confining. Loreology borrows from and is based in several different fields, so it's interdisciplinary. Depth psychology is part of that, so is eco-psychology. The field I named some years ago, parapsychology, is part of it. Also my own background teaching myth, because mythic motifs come to life all the time, as I've repeatedly said during these podcasts. So we're going to look at this through a loreology lens and see what we can see. Now, one narrative that's being told about why people get pulled into extremism is socioeconomic, and there's some truth in that. That when people are relatively badly off economically and they've been neglected for a long time by politics, then after a while they get resentful and they start trying to fight back. And when they find other resentful people, then they get together. But the problem with that explanation is there are plenty of white nationalists, in other words, racists. White nationalism is a form of white supremacy. Look it up. So there are plenty of people in that category who aren't poor, who had relatively, if not affluent, relatively abundant upbringings economically. So when we stop simply labeling these people and shaming them, and we actually listen to what they have to say, particularly the ones who are recovering from that, they call themselves formers. And so former neo-Nazis, former white nationalists, they will talk a lot about how insignificant they felt, how they didn't feel like they had any kind of a sense of purpose. They felt invisible. The powers in our culture that run everything, which of course are largely owned by big money, paid no attention to them. And so, in addition to not really belonging to anything, which is a basic human need, they also have been bathed in propaganda, social media, Fox News, all the rest of it. And that propaganda is far worse than it used to be because it's greatly amplified. And it's possible now to immerse yourself in it the whole time you're awake during the day. Previously, if you were somebody like a Ku Klux Klansman, you had to go to some meeting place in order to talk to other Klansmen. But now it's not true. Now there's huge groups online, and you can just be in those groups all the time. And when you're not there, then you're listening to the propaganda on the social media or through other forms. And it's actually unregulated hate propaganda. And that's one of the basic problems in our culture right now, is that it is unregulated. No one's stopping it. To use one example, Twitter, when it still existed for a while, was kicking off white supremacists, and then Elon Musk took over, and because he is one, he put them all back. So that's a big problem. Another factor, of course, is patriarchy, and a lot of the participants in white nationalism, not all, are young white males, and the imagery that they collect around themselves is interesting because it's this hyper-masculine set of symbols that often emphasize conflict and warfare. They're trying to find their way to be men, but they're doing it in a way that's symptomatic and hateful. Now, these people are certainly responsible for their own behavior, especially when it's hateful. But when we only focus on that, then we lose the big picture of the structural forces in culture that render us invisible and anonymous. A minor example that I mentioned in my podcast on friendly tech and how creepy it sounds is when you call some big business or government agency for help and you get funneled into a phone tree from which there is no escape. And there's nothing you can do about it, and no one will talk to you. So that's one example among hundreds and even thousands that we face every day. Some of us are better at facing those than others. And when you combine other factors like not having a group to belong to, not having friends, being different from other people in certain ways, then you've got a good recipe for radicalism right there. Especially when some charismatic leader comes along and says, "Oh, I get it. I get where you are. I have the same concerns you do. Wouldn't it be better if we could change things, and by doing that, have a different kind of culture?" Which sounds good on the surface of it, but what they mean, of course, is change things by force. And the people who deliver this message are swindlers, as all authoritarians are. There's a very revealing comment that was made about this by a former Mooney cultist, Diane Benscotter, and so to quote her, when you run into that situation where somebody is recruiting you, here's the quotation. She says, "It establishes this camaraderie and this feeling of righteousness and this cause for your life, and that feels very invigorating and almost addictive. You feel like you're fighting the battle for goodness. And all of a sudden, you feel like you're the hero." That's very interesting. There is an expert on extremism and deprogramming people from it, Jocelyn Bellinger, and I want to quote her next. She says, "Our research shows that there are three important commonalities shared by extremist movements. The need, which refers to people's desire for personal significance, to matter, to be important. The narrative, which tells an individual where violence should be directed to gain significance. And the network, the group that validates the collective narrative and dispenses rewards such as respect and honor to its members." And she uses Trump supporters who are violent as an example. She says, here we have disenfranchised white people, there's the need. Grieving a supposedly stolen election and believing that the Capitol and other MAGA supporters, which is the network part, is an act of patriotism that will overturn the results. That's the narrative. She also points out that when you simply argue with these people and their beliefs, it gets you nowhere. And if anything, it strengthens their conviction that they're the ones who have the truth and people like you are on the outside. And so she recommends putting them in situations where they're in groups that give them some sense of personal significance and belonging. Backing that up is an article that came out in The Atlantic in 2021. It was an excerpt from a book written by Carla Power. And the name of the article is How to De-Radicalize Your Town. And she uses the example of Mechelen, Belgium. In Mechelen, about a third of citizens at one time supported an extremist right-wing party. And there's also a history there of young Belgians joining ISIS. It's not so much in Mechelen itself, but in the surrounding regions. And so then in 2001, there was a new mayor in town, Bart Summers, and he wanted to make sure that everybody felt a sense of belonging. And because a big source of grievance is the feeling of social exclusion. And of course, poverty contributes too. So he started putting some things in place. He wanted the city to be green and safe, and he began some projects, including transforming an old brewery into a heritage center. And this brought some private investment. It gave people of different social classes things that they could do together. And that was a big part of his strategy, putting people together with different values, different perspectives, and having them find common ground in beautifying and improving the city. And one result of that was that, Mechelen used to be notorious for being the dirtiest city in Flanders, and it went from that to being the most beautiful. He also put in place a program for welcoming newcomers, immigrants to the city. And what they did was they paired them with people who already live in Mechelen and who volunteer to do this. And for 6 months, they work together so that the newcomers learn Dutch and they learn about the history of the city and they do things together. And so in this way, people who are new are integrated into the community. This experiment also shows how diversity and unity work together. It's a very diverse town, people from different religious backgrounds, including Muslim, people from different parts of the world. And in the end, though, what a lot of them said was that they were Mechelars. So they didn't give up their identity as Turks or Moroccans or what have you. But that was what they tended to respond when asked about who they were. So they had a communal sense of identity. Now, there was a terrorist attack on Brussels in 2016. And the mayor took a very nuanced approach to this. So he publicly condemned the attack, the killings, the killers, and so on. But he refused to cast the attackers as other. And he said publicly that he wouldn't do that because the country's Muslims were victims twice over of the attack. First, the attack itself and the trauma that it created, but also they were Belgian citizens whose religion was used to justify the attacks, and so they were victimized twice. So he changed the narrative about things like that. And there were other steps that were put in place, like there was a stronger police presence, but the police were trained in community policing. And when people could see this for themselves, they felt safer. Especially when they noticed that the officers usually weren't wearing guns or bulletproof vests. And so the assessment by Summers and by a lot of people who lived there at that time, this is 2021, is that the city is a beacon of hope and that people who go there have a sense of belonging and civic pride. that is strengthened rather than diminished by their other affiliations. Unity and diversity. There are many other examples of people who are doing work against extremism and racism. And of course, I'd love to mention the exemplary Daryl Davis, exemplary and courageous. He's a black man who goes up to Ku Klux Klan members and offers to buy them coffee and have a meal with them. And by doing this, he shows them that he too is a human being just like them. And a number of them leave the Klan because of his interventions. There's Dominic Barter, who does restorative justice around the world. There's many examples. So what I've tried to do just for myself and my own use is to take these practices and arrange them in a list with emphasis on how all of these practices change the story of everybody involved. They change the story of the extremists to give them a sense of significance. They change the story of people who say, well, they're just racist and that's the end of it. A lot of transforming work goes on the level of stories that we tell ourselves. So I wanted to give you some examples from my list here. One, in terms of overcoming resistant people who were stuck in that cult-like story of pathological belonging, is to make a human connection first. No shaming, no blaming, and yes, of course, holding people accountable for their behavior. That has to be in place. But not attacking them personally. Chloe Valdery puts it really well in her theory of enchantment. She says, treat people like human beings, not like political abstractions. So that's a necessary first step from which others follow. So for instance, being able to listen to the stories of people who are stuck in extremism and to actually make space for those tellings, which is hard to do, especially when there's a lot of hatred and racism and other forms of pathological anger mixed in. But really listening deeply and asking oneself, what do they fear the most? Because this is all fear-based. Fundamentalism, for instance, is a fear of change and also of diversity. From a lorology perspective, what gods are they stuck to? This heroic rhetoric sounds to me like the altar of Heracles, Mars. One could use examples from different cultures too. Set in the Egyptian pantheon, for instance, there's a lot of posturing, and I spent years in men's groups seeing this unfold, by the way. A lot of macho breastbeating, so trying to be a hero but not understanding how. So more about that in a moment. So listening in a way that picks up the images and metaphors and lore in the stories that fuel this. Now, if you're from outside the extremist group, you have extra work to do. There's no magical pill, including storytelling, that in most cases will allow you to get inside somebody who is being an extremist and convince them of anything. It works a lot better when you have formers doing the work. But either way, it takes extra effort to earn the trust of people who are stuck in a paranoid worldview. They'll be suspicious of you, and it's probably best to be open about why you want them to change. Starting with their heroic narrative of isolation and helping them feel and locate their way into other forms of community and significance. Unless you're able to shift the story that way, they're going to stay stuck in their old story because it's serving them emotionally, even though on some level it's making them and everybody else miserable. As one neo-Nazi said, receiving compassion when we least deserved it helped us to make big change. Thank you.